Seth Leibson, Chris Buskirk. It's principles and politics. The Seth and Chris Show is on now.
Welcome back. Wednesday, June 7th, 2016. I am Seth Leibson. Chris Buskirk out this week. He'll be back next week. Chris Llewellyn sitting in the producer's chair. Happy to take your calls at 602-508-0960. Delighted to welcome back a dear, dear friend and one of the country's, if not world's, most important teachers for the times we live in, our good friend Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, author of a great best-selling book I urge upon anyone and everyone, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Welcome back, Dr. J.
Seth, it's always great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
Always, always, always. And the times require it. I want to drill down a little bit, but can I start with a big picture question I've been meaning to ask you for some time, Dr. Jasser? I look at the last 8 years. You wrote a book about it. I wrote a book about it. I look at the last 8 years in the fight against terrorism, or the terrorists' fight against us, as a time of appeasement, a time of defining terrorism down. Are we doing better? Are we doing better? What could we be doing better at? Yes, I'm talking about presidential leadership. Not everything is great, but something has turned and changed a bit, has it not?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I think in the last administration and for a long time, the big picture that we've been missing is identifying the ideology that we're fighting a global evangelical movement of political or theopolitical Islam that wants to spread not only in a violent way, but in a nonviolent, civilizational way. But in a short term, we've seen a lot of progress already in the last few months. One of the reasons you're seeing a lot more attacks by ISIS is like treating cancer. When you finally get down to the tumor and start cutting it out, the patient will get sicker. And this is exactly what's happening. They're beginning to act out in every way they can because President Trump has taken the war to them. And he's not constrained and handcuffed his Secretary of Defense and his military to do what they need to do. So ISIS is on the run in Raqqa in northern Iraq, and Iran is being isolated. So you're seeing some shifts and some disruption, if you will. And I think, praise first is that we're seeing a resetting of the stability that we had in the 21st century. But then criticism, if you will, It's the 21st century now, and we had an Arab awakening, and I hope a Trump doctrine will be to not only recalibrate the stability, but realize that the peoples of the Middle East are looking right now at a new era of a bottom-up revolution where the old establishment has its days numbered. And I hope this reset, which will restabilize, and in a whack-a-mole, we went from Al-Qaeda now to ISIS, and we will get rid of ISIS, I think, in the next 6 months. But if we don't fix this ideological problem and start working with the revolutions and saying that we're going to fight evangelical Islamism with evangelical liberty, which is the only way to do it, we are not going to, we're going to see a return of another radical group in 2 or 3 years.
That is always the worry, and I know it's a question you often will get asked when you talk about this, Dr. Jasser, which is, sure, this is a region of the world, when we're talking about the Middle East, too long beset by tyranny and autocracies. And yes, would that we could have had a successful, say, revolution like we saw in 2009 in Iran before that was shut down, and in some part shut down by Barack Obama and his rhetoric. But the concern always being, is what comes next equally dangerous or better? That's always the concern, right?
Yeah, but, bottom line is you make choices as you get to them. Things may get worse, but the result of a decision doesn't then prove that the previous decision you made was the wrong one if you made a moral one.
Right.
So the fact that Iran has been beset by an Islamist regime since 1979 doesn't mean that the Shah was better. It means that now the Iranian people went through 30 years of hell and would never elect a theocracy again. The Brotherhood running Egypt did more to destroy the Islamist ideas of Egypt than we could have done propping up dictators for the next 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I will tell you, there is a catharsis involved in letting people go through revolutions and continuing to be on the right side of history, which is liberty, so that they can work that through their system. And Islam is in that time in history that the West was. Imagine if there was some superpower during the American Revolution that said, let's not let them have that civil war or that revolution. Let's not have the French have their revolution because we want to side with the tyrants and make it more stable. That didn't happen, and it allowed the West to defeat theocracy. So I think we need to side with those that might be weaker, but yet side with universal principles of human rights that will ultimately let them grow through this period of disruption, and which may set us back into a more insecure time in history. But I think in the long term, it will be the only pathway to a more stable world.
I was talking a little bit on this a week or so ago, and I don't remember the event that sparked the conversation exactly off the top of my head, Dr. Jasser, but someone called in and said, what would the elements of a reformation in any of these hardened countries look like? Maybe it was coincident with Donald Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia and the speech he gave there. and I recited a few things. I think taking some cues from you. You tell me if my list is close to right, what I got wrong, what you would add to it. I know, first of all, there has to be a division, a separation between mosque and state. I think it also begins with female and women empowerment and something having to do with literacy and norms of free speech and the ability to read and write what you want. That's my start. Where do I go from here? What do I have wrong?
That's the great elements. That's why our American Islamic Forum's mission statement is to separate mosque and state. I think that can happen in my lifetime. I think the other elements, improving literacy, where you have 50% illiteracy in the Middle East, I think that the key is to create environments where civil society can question authority. And that's why, Seth, for any American listening that thinks that the West is irrelevant and what we do with Muslims here is irrelevant, if you're going to wait for Islam to reform in the belly of the beast of Saudi Arabia, like this facade of a counterterrorism center that was just opened in Riyadh or in Egypt, it will never happen. That reformation will never happen until they defeat those regimes. That's why we have to start the path like we did in the Cold War. We helped through institutes here in the West, creating the ideas and advancing the ideas of freedom and liberty so that when the Estonias and the Romanias fell, we were then able to quickly push those ideas into those societies. Right now, Muslims are doing nothing to advance the ideas of liberty and criticize our own institutions here in mosques in the valley, across the country. We're letting the Saudi sympathizers run our community, even in the Free Society of America, with no tools. And that's why Manchester and London are happening.
Yes, this is a hugely important point. This last point, all of it was important. This last point is what I want to focus on with you a little bit. I don't know if you had a chance to read Theodore Dalrymple's piece in the Wall Street Journal a day or two ago, talking about what was going on in England and the tremendous appeasement that has been given into, for lack of a better word, but you get the point, a brotherhood attitude. The tremendous appeasement where authorities not only would turn a blind eye to these documentaries like The Jihadi Next Door, where authorities have instituted basically no-go zones for, Islamist, if you will, Islamist practices where kids in the white neighborhoods, if they don't go to school for a couple months, you get a knock on the door. Where if it was an Islamist neighborhood, you could have years where the kids were taken out of schools and not gone. No one said anything. The way that they have allowed Islamists to run rampant in their own little areas throughout Great Britain and actually through much of Europe. This is a huge problem. This is a problem that the West faces because this is the West doing it. We can ask of Saudi Arabia a division of mosque and state. What do we say to Great Britain, which is kowtowing to it?
Exactly. And what has happened is they've allowed all of a sudden, as the The war on radical Islam came to them with the 79 revolution, and then the 93 bombing in New York and the 9/11. We've quickly tried to figure out what our strategy is. Meanwhile, all these immigrant populations who have not ideologically assimilated, and Europe has a bigger problem with that, we're engaging the very lobbyists that have been funded by these regimes out of Saudi Arabia and Iran, and engaging who they want to prop up to protect the status quo, rather than engaging those who believe in the principles which you laid out. Equality of men and women, fighting anti-Semitism, all the parts that reform would need, we ignore in the Muslim community.
Do you have time for one more segment, Doctor?
Yes.
We'll be right back with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. His book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. 602-508-0960. Call us. Be right back. Welcome back to the Seth and Chris Show. I am Seth Leibson, delighted to be rejoined by Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. Dr. Jasser, the news has been everywhere and seems not to be relenting. England, a week after the Manchester bombing, goes through another terrorist spree on the London Bridge. ISIS taking credit for both. And today we read news that ISIS is now active and engaging in terrorism in, of all places, Iran. What's going on here?
Well, I think there's just so much to learn about this attack in Iran. Many are probably wondering, since ISIS's primary enemy in Syria is the Assad regime, who is a Shia Alawite sect working very closely with Hezbollah in Iran, why didn't that happen sooner?
Yeah.
And the bottom line is that probably the most difficult place for Sunni Arab-speaking militants to attack would be Tehran. It's a Farsi-speaking nation. They're not Arabs. Sunnis would stick out like a sore thumb. So the question is, how would they have gotten in there? Well, I'm guessing, but the bottom line is it's pretty obvious that they either infiltrated the Assad regime military or worked their way into the Arab Shia in Iraq and somehow, triculated into the Iranian airspace, if you will, working their way to Tehran, and they attacked the greatest symbols they could, which are the parliament, and then the tomb of Khomeini. So the bottom line is over the last month, they've seen a unprecedented unification of the Sunni countries to get rid of ISIS. And President Trump's speech and bringing together of the coalition has really shrunk the area that they've had to control. They've lost their economic input from oil sales, etc. So what they want to do is get back to the old and inflame the Shia-Sunni war. And this is the quickest way to do it. The quickest way to weaken the Sunni attention on the ISIS threat in Syria is to get Iran. And what did the Iranian press release say today? They are blaming Saudi Arabia for this. So the ISIS folks are getting exactly what they want. Somehow they got an operation done in Tehran. It shows that they're a lot more functional than we think they are. And bottom line is they'd love to see the Middle East in flames. In the old historic, where we saw in the Iran-Iraq war, millions died, and they like to see that old history come to fruition again so that they can get back to the chaotic mess of building their caliphate.
Yeah, what you described, if it took place in any of the scenarios you described, I'm sitting here thinking ISIS is a lot more sophisticated than we thought, certainly more sophisticated than deserving of a label like junior varsity.
Very. And they understand our weaknesses in the West. They understand the weaknesses of the regimes in the Middle East. And they're true to their ideology. These are not people who need jobs or are affected by climate change and other nonsense. They are filling vacuums. And we need to navigate a way to decimate them quickly, which is, I believe, what Secretary Mattis and others are doing. But we also need to figure out a path in the Middle East, especially in Syria, where we begin to have a third path, which doesn't include the Assad, Hezbollah, Iran axis, and also sees an end to ISIS, but begins to navigate a third path for a future of Syria, which, if there isn't a third path, will continue to use this sectarian division to create wars in that region.
Can we do it without putting our own boots on the ground?
Absolutely. You don't need, no, listen, we put our boots on the ground in Iraq because there was no revolution. We went in to destroy a regime that would not let us know about weapons of mass destruction that they had. But this in Syria is a whole population is mobilized. There's a civil war happening. We don't need to enter that fray. We just need to, I think, return it to a civil war, get Iran and Russia out of there, and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and other foreign influences that are radicalizing the revolution. Let them have their civil war, create areas of safe havens for the general population, and then ultimately let it play its way out, in which you would truly see the end of the Assad regime if they ended the support from Iran and Russia.
That's an important point that I hope does not get lost when it comes to the Assad regime. There's been far too much cultural appeasement of it. Of course, those, things like those magazine spreads on Mrs. Assad, glamorizing her, or Hillary Clinton talking about possibly Assad being a man who would be open to moderacy. That's part one. That day has to be over by now for sure, and there has to be a lot of apologies, I think, given to people like you and people who said no, Assad is hardly, the Assad regime is hardly moderate or reformist, I believe was her word, Hillary Clinton's. That's one. The other is knowing that it is a satrap, really, of Russia and Iran. You read a lot now about how the Assad regime is supported by Russia, but it's also been the tip of the spear for Iran for too many years, hasn't it?
Absolutely. It is the Shia crescent that the Iranian Khomeinists are talking about, taking that crescent and make it into a full moon. So they are, as much as they don't want to see their city attacked by ISIS, in many ways they now have justification for blaming Saudi Arabia, as we saw. And we need to maintain sort of the adults in the neighborhood, if you will, but also to use Syria as a clinic in which we say, you know what, we are not going to appease genocide, which Assad has done, or work with the Islamists. The Saudis now are putting the walls up against Qatar because they're saying they're fueling radicalization globally of the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, the Saudis were too. Yeah. And we need to call them on it and say, you know what, the founding fathers of ISIS were really the Saudis.
That's right.
We need to step away from that and help the more secular groups grow slowly.
No, that's right. I wanted to hit the ceiling when I was going after Iran on one segment maybe a couple months back, and someone said, well, you're an apologist for the Saudi regime, and I just, my gosh, you can be against both, and I think my credentials, as I think your credentials, are pretty good on being anti-Saudi Arabia. My goodness. But it is a global fight, and sometimes you have to fight Imperial Japan as you have to fight Adolf Hitler.
Yep, that's why going after one mafia family, you don't go after all three of them in the neighborhood at the same time. You go one at a time. So the Saudis better figure out what's going to happen once we contain Iran and Qatar and move on to really start to listen to the people of the Middle East, which are the only answer to their future, not the old guard, long-bearded guys who are radicalizing people not only in the Middle East but across the planet into London and America.
I was quoting you in one of these segments recently, and some had a caller said, where can I learn more about this Dr. Jasser you're speaking of? Where can people go to learn more about you, Dr. Jasser, and your project?
Yeah, our website for our organization is aifdemocracy.org, aifdemocracy.org, and I have a newsletter that goes out once a month that's starting. It's at takebackislam.com.
Wonderful. Dr. Jasser, I appreciate your friendship. I appreciate your intellect. I appreciate everything you do. Thanks for your time as well.
Likewise, Seth. God bless. Appreciate it.
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, folks, founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, author of an important book that I urge everyone as they look towards their summer reading, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Read it in consonance with my book. All right. We'll be right back. 602-508-0960. Thank you, Dr. Jasser.